lumpy and bumpy bit, as you've seen from all the maps, and to here, this is called Chapel Hill. And if you read anything, even in English Heritage, all the official documents will tell you that this is where Richard III built his memorial chapel for the dead at Towton. So obviously in 1999, we went up to the top of Chapel Hill as part of funding from the Blood Red Roses programme, and we dug several very long trenches all over there. And without a shadow of a doubt, there is not one single trace of not just a chapel, but of any sort of building material or absolutely anything. That is a field. It has been a field since the medieval period, and it's still a field now. And there is nothing. I'll tell you where the garden used to end. Here's the fence line. So that was Chapel Hill, and this is supposed to be Chapel Garth. Presumably called Chapel Garth because it's the enclosure that was on Chapel Hill. So if the chapel isn't on top of Chapel Hill, then surely it's in Chapel Garth. So we covered the whole of this field, literally, not that end, but all here. That's covered in huge amounts of ridge and furrow, original medieval field, ridge and furrow. We covered all this all the way to the corner, all here with magnetometer and resistivity. We've excavated the top of Chapel Hill. There is no sign. I'm not going to say 100%, but no, we can't find any evidence of anything on top of there. So we came back here, and since then we've been doing all sorts of bits and pieces, including TV work and everything. But it was only when Michael came to me about a year ago, I think, and he says he's going to alter all this. This, when we did the TV work for the Medieval Dead programmes, if you've seen it, all this is covered in bushes and shrubs. So we couldn't even do some proper geophysics in here. So we thought, right, Michael took all the bushes and shrubs and cleaned it all out to it. He's going to returf this, obviously, and then turn it into a garden again. He said, well, you got the chance to. First you want to do some geophysics. So over there is our kind people who've done huge amounts of radar. Oh, and they did some more mag. Nothing decent turned up apart from the same sort of shape in this lawn was a big rectangle, very big rectangle, and he had little offshoots of little rectangles attached to it. Now, we got very excited about this when we first did the geophysics in about 97, 98 or whatever it was, although it was always going to be too big for a chapel. It's bigger than the hall. So it was either going to be a massive chapel or it's going to be something else. And one of the problems I had with that, the geophysics corresponded exactly to a 1947 aerial photograph from up there, post-war, which showed exactly the same rectangle, clear of shrubbery and bushes and everything, and it was a garden path. Now it could be that the garden path was superimposed over the top of the building, because obviously if there's a building underneath it, you're not going to grow much underneath it, are you? So there was always a chance that this thing was some sort of building remains. So when did we start the excavation? Earlier this year anyway. Once Richard had done the radar, we came up with exactly the same pattern as we had in the original geophysics. So the next thing obviously to do is finally get to grips with it and check it to find out what those geophysical surveys had shown. So we did. These aren't graves, by the way, although they do look like them. We did a series of test bits. Usually started off by 1 metre square over the anomalies on the geophysical surveys. And then when we got down to any archaeology, we expanded one way or another to see if we could find what was under the ground that corresponded with the results on the geophysical survey. And test bit there, test bit here, there's another grave type thing here. There was one here. Because of the sun of the part, you can actually see exactly where they were because the turf's not regrown. There was another one over there, so it was a series of about 10 test bits, including some in the lawn over there. And the results were, drum roll, pass.
Oh.
These things, what appears to have happened, and this, if I don't know how many of you are gardeners, I'm sure there's one or two out there. If you have a path, all you do is take the turf off, or leave the turf on, and then you start digging either side of the path. That bit of ground starts to get higher than your path. So eventually, the most boggiest bits in your garden are going to be where your paths are, because you're walking up and down all the time, and everywhere else is slightly higher. So it's going to collect water. What do? You start putting gravel down there. If it's very, very boggy, you put a lot more gravel down there. If you've got excessive amounts of building rubble, that's of things going on in your house and your garden, you put some sizable chunks of building rubble down there. So what we found on just about all these test pits was a feature about that wide, flat as a pancake on the top. On top of this was smaller gravel, and underneath there was bigger gravel in a sort of a U shape. And that showed up incredibly well on all the geophysical surveys, on the aerial photograph from 1947, and we would have loved it to be a chapel or any sort of structure, but it isn't. Not only that, we looked at other identifiable features in the geophysical survey and put, just to be sure, we put some test trenches over there as well. So from that tree this way, all it is paths. But the interesting thing is that when you go that way into the garden, as in the lawn garden, it starts going different. So if you'll turn round now, I'll nip over here. So when you get past these two ornamental urny things here, as you can see, it's a different shape of ground. If you look down here and look behind you, it's sort of dome shaped. If you look over there, it's suddenly gone very flat. And if you look on all the plans, all the maps and everything, this round about here was the end of Chapel Garth. That was the rougher bit of the garden, and always has been. But when you go back under here, slightly further near towards the end of that wall over there, running across there, it changes. And in my lifetime, our lifetime, in the corner of the lawn over there's big ornamental goldfish pond, all sorts of things in that bit of the garden. But the interesting thing as far as we were concerned is, apart from here, where we found a big anomaly running right across here, and when we first wondered what it was, we got a metal detector because it looked like a pipe, so we thought, right, we'll trace the path of the pipe. It went all the way up there, it goes all the way up there to what used to be a cattle trough in the corner of the Chapel Garth over there. And then when we checked it this way, and as you walk back here later, look down the side of that tree, there's a big steel pipe still sticking out the ground right next to the tree. So we thought, haha, that's the other end of it. And then it went down there a little bit, then disappeared, presumably when it's been chopped off, presumably connected with the work for the goldfish pond and stuff. So somebody's had a water supply put into this garden, probably in the 50s, 40s, 50s, something like that, maybe even earlier slightly. But the good news was, here, massive big over here. Before I tell you what was in that one, we put another test trench over there. Somewhere. Oh, there it is. Right, so Bob was digging this one. He went down and he started to find some walls and things. The walls looked interesting, but nothing very significant in terms of the scale of them. In the corner of one of the walls was a huge pile of coal. And the coal was still there, all the granule bits of coal, and it's the stuff, I'm sure a lot of you remember when we had coal fires. If you take all the big bits of coal off the tops, you end up with all the dust on the bottom. So this was a pile of coal against a wall which looked like a coal house. And of course it was probably a coal house, and somebody had been pouring coal in here for a long, long time. All the residue and dust at the bottom, which nobody ever uses, had still remained at the bottom in a building which presumably a coal house. And that's almost certainly from the 1700s onwards. Remember, they would have had coal before anybody else would, because they're rich, and the rich had access to coal to burn before us poor mortals. So we think that sometime or other there was a little building there that was a coal house, and then just behind it we found this big anomaly, geophysical survey anomaly. So who was it? It wasn't Bob. Who started that one off?
Richard. Oh,
the other Richard. Well, Richard finished it. Alison and Richard, like a man possessed, or people possessed, because it was about that deep. So we started off with a little test pit. The test pit got longer and longer and bigger as we got deeper and deeper. And then at the bottom of this, exactly where the anomaly was, remember it goes from that wall all the way over there, was a wall about that wide. And the top was nicely finished off. And somebody had obviously demolished that wall very, very cleanly. Now, this bit's important when we get to the bit that's in front. So this wall was made of a very pinky, paley, well, it was limestone, flat limestone blocks, not ashlar blocks. They haven't been carved out. It's just big blocks of limestone, about that wide, sort of anything around that size, all laid on top of each other with a very pinky, pale mortar. That's important. So we had a wall, and the more it went this way, we presume, the deeper it got. It looked better on the geophysics, and when it got that way, it almost faded out. Now again, if you look at the landscape, the land, if you look over the edge of the ha-ha, it's about that high. So this wall is deeper at that end than it is that end, and it's buried, and it's been cleaned, shaved off just below the surface about that high in a very clean manner. So somebody has taken that wall down in a very systematic way, cleaned it all off and said, right, that's as deep as we want to go, and they've left the rest of it. So now we've got a wall that runs under here, hardly existing over there, very deep over there. Presumably it's the old ground level. So we've got a wall that existed before this land was raised up in almost certainly the Georgian period to form what we call the ha-ha, which is the stepped ground for this hill. So now if you look round again, you can see how much the hill has changed. It used to be quite a domed landscape, and what they've done is they built a ha-ha and then they've filled it in with wheelbarrows from about, where's the hill? From about here to there. So it starts off very thin here, where the hill was, and they fill that in to about that depth. Now that is hundreds, if not thousands of tons of rubbish. First, where did they get the rubbish from? Where did they get all that material from to fill that, the length of this, all the way down there? That's thousands of tons of rubble from somewhere. But also, what's inside there? And why did they fill it in? Now we know there's a buried wall here, but we don't know what else is in there. and I'm not going to start digging that up because that is a huge amount of work. But the geophysical survey shows there are walls dotted around, nothing significant, almost certainly to do with levels of backfilling that goes. They look like walls, but they're potentially levels of backfilling. I don't know if Richard would agree or disagree with this, but there's nothing that you would get your teeth into and say, well, that looks like a building to me. So there's a couple of anomalies there. Where's all the rubble from? Did they knock something else down and fill that hole with another building from somewhere here? The other thing is, how old is this wall? Now, we didn't know at the time, but I think now we'll be able to find out. But the other thing to recognise is this wall is almost exactly parallel to the hall. So this wall, what was it, 16 metres or something? We measured it one day. So we lined it all up with ranging rods and measured from there to there and there to there, and it's parallel to the hall. So this does seem to be associated with that structure. Now, we'll go back to the front again now, and then we'll also tell you what's been going on and why we think we know, well, I think I know what's going on here. I haven't told these guys yet.